2 months passed since my dad's death. Death makes it sound like something that just happened to him. Like he passed away or was found unresponsive or something quiet and lame like that. No. He was killed, and was killed gruesomely. Ripped limb from limb. While he was still alive, they said. Whatever. It's been 2 months since the end of his life. Our house sits on the outskirts of town, right out on the middle of Bray Road. It's a quiet spot, except for the occasional passing car or rustle of leaves in the wind. Across the street from us is the Ash's property. They've got about 8 acres, mostly wooded, while our place isn't even on a full acre. I usually loved my home, despite what happened. Most small-town gay kids couldn't wait to fly as fast and far away as possible. But I wasn't going anywhere. My name is Sean Anderson, and I guess you could say I'm your average high school senior from a small town. Elkhorn, Wisconsin is where I've lived my whole life. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, whether you want them to or not. The Ash family has been our neighbors for as long as I can remember, but I can't say we've ever been close. Cameron, their oldest son, and I never really clicked. We moved in different circles, I guess you could say. Though it did come with some regret. Years of being athletic, working out, running, and all that made him exceptionally nice to look at. On the mornings I left at the same time as him, I couldn't help but stare as he donned his electrical apprentice uniform. On this particular late afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. It was one of the first warm days of the year, a welcome change after the lingering chill of winter. I stood on our front porch, taking in the peace and quiet which surrounded me. It was on a day much like this one when they found my dad. What was left of him anyway. His body was discovered in a drainage ditch not far from here, a gruesome sight which shook our little town to its core. There was endless speculation about what happened to him. Some said it was a pack of wild dogs, although no one seen any in the area. Others whispered about wolves, even though sightings of them were just as rare. And then there were those who pointed fingers at everything from old legends, vampires, to my mom and me. Despite the rumors and suspicions swirling around us, Elkhorn remained a beautiful place. Bray Road had always been my home, and despite everything, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. But as the days passed and the wounds of my dad's terrible end refused to heal, I wondered if we could continue on in a place like that. The late afternoon sun bathed Bray Road in a warm golden light as I paced back and forth on our front porch. The quiet stillness of the day enveloped me, offering a brief respite from the turmoil swirling inside my head. But despite the tranquility of the surroundings, a nagging feeling gnawed at my insides, urging me to act. After much internal debate, I finally made up my mind. I needed to talk to Cameron no matter what. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to say, but I felt a desperate need to break the silence. With determined steps, I crossed the street to his house, hopefully appearing much braver on the outside than I was on the inside. As I approached the front door, I rehearsed what I would say in my mind, trying to sound firm and strong. But before I could even knock, his mom appeared on the steps, her expression cold and unwelcoming. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Ash. I'm here to see—" "He isn't home," she said curtly, her tone leaving no room for rebuttal or further questions. I felt a pang of frustration and déjà vu wash over me. It reminded me of a time in 5th grade when Cameron was supposedly sick, and Mrs. Ash gave me the same response when I went to deliver his homework. But I knew then, as I knew now, that he was home. She shut the door on me, and as I stood on the porch, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The perspective of our house from this side of the road was foreign to me. I crossed into territory which didn't belong to me. Even though it was my home I was looking at, I still felt as if I trespassed onto something which wasn't mine. A lifetime living in those 4 walls, and I still found it weird to see how it looked from other people's point of view. From Cameron's point of view. Turning back to the house, I caught a glimpse of him in an upstairs window. Like when I brought him his homework. But when I looked down to see his mom in their front window for only a moment, he was gone, leaving nothing behind. I felt sorry for him, as I imagined him always trapped in that house. At school and around town he seemed popular. But at home, it was almost like his parents kept him constantly secluded. Guests and visitors were definitely not allowed. As I made my way back across the street to my own house, I couldn't shake the feeling I intruded into a world I didn't belong. Like I crossed a boundary which should never have been crossed. The next night hung heavy around me as I drove home from the store. The darkness swallowed the road ahead of my car. It always did this, but with everything going on, it felt even more encroaching than it usually did. As I rounded a bend in the road, something caught my eye. A shape, lurking at the edge of the woods. I slammed on my brakes, and my car came to rest at an angle on the road. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew whatever it wasn't a person. Wasn't human. It took one good look at me before it crossed the road in only 3 strides. Panic surged through me. For a moment I sat frozen in terror. But then, with a mental shove, I forced myself into action. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, the engine roaring to life and the tires let out a small screech as I sped away from the nightmare who crossed my path. I didn't stop until I reached my house, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I jumped from my car. My mom appeared in the doorway, her face creased with concern as she rushed towards me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with worry. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words got caught in my throat. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I saw, what I met on the dark stretch of road. Across the street, his house loomed in the night, a dark silhouette against the starlit sky. All 3 cars were in the driveway, but there was no sign of life within. No lights on. No one home. I swallowed hard, my mind racing as I struggled to make sense of what happened. I walked alone in the late afternoon sun, followed the familiar path to the spot where they found my dad's remains. I should have been thinking about him, but I wasn't. Although no one could have imagined the terrible way it happened, I don't think anyone alive thought much about my dad anymore. Other memories flooded my mind, transporting me back to a few years earlier, to a day I would never forget. I was out hiking with 2 friends, who soon after this incident, I stopped hanging out with. We walked to the sound of our laughter echoing through the trees as we made our way along the creek. But as we reached the water's edge, our laughter died away, replaced by stunned silence. There, sitting upright and drinking water using their hands, were a group of strange animals unlike anything we had ever seen before. Their eyes gleamed in the sunlight, their movements fluid but unhuman. I remember the way my heart pounded in my chest as I watched them, a mixture of fear and awe swirling inside me. I remember we couldn't move until the smallest one sniffed the air and looked directly at me. That encounter haunted me in the years which followed, lingering in the back of my thoughts. The winter was mild, the weather unseasonably warm for this time of year. As I stood near the ditch on the side of the road, I couldn't help but marvel at the peacefulness of the spot, despite everything which happened there. But amidst the tranquility, darker memories began to surface. Memories of my dad's abuse. A sudden snap of a twig shattered the quiet serenity I had been enjoying, jolting me back to the present. I looked around quickly, but there was nothing, and no one in sight. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense of eyes boring into me. I've had that feeling creep on me my entire life. Where I usually believed it was only a form of paranoia, I began to think maybe there was something more alive behind this feeling which has followed me for many years. As I turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever watched me was still out there waiting. The walk home was a journey through a nightmare, every shadow hiding a potential threat, every rustle of leaves asking me to confirm they are nothing more than the wind. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Occasional branches knocked, or long dead leaves rustled in the breeze, but it wasn't enough to confirm or even alleviate my suspicions. As a car sped towards me, I briefly considered flagging it down to ask for help. But as it drew closer, I realized how close I was to home. The thought of how ridiculous I would look, standing there on the side of the road, stopped me in my tracks. I let out a breath, laughing to myself at the absurdity of it all after the car passed. But my laughter died in my throat as a loud branch snapped behind me, the sound echoing in the night air. I spun around in time to see a blur of a large, dark silhouette practically standing over me. Panic surged through me, and I took off running as fast as my legs would carry me. Each pump of my legs felt more and more useless as I imagined the unnatural creature who only needed 3 strides to clear a whole road. But to my surprise, nothing caught me. I burst through the front door of my house, slamming it shut and locking it behind me with trembling hands, and pressed against it with all my weight. I peered out the window, my heart still racing, expecting to see the creature's twisted form staring back at me. But instead, I was met with the sight of my mom's face, inches from the glass. I jumped at the sudden appearance, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I quickly opened the door. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded, her voice laced with concern. "Who are you running from?" I scanned the darkness outside, but there was no sign of anyone else. My gaze flicked across the street, a knot of unease forming in the pit of my stomach. "What is it?" my mom asked, her voice trembling with anger as she turned in the direction I looked at. "Has that boy done something?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I knew then I had to confront Cameron, to find out once and for all what was going on. An hour later, my mom left for her night shift job. The clock showed it was 9:15, but I didn't care how late it was. With determination in my step, I marched across the road, the cold night air biting at my skin. A stark reminder it was only the second day of spring. As I approached the front door, I was afraid they'd catch me there, even though their attention was exactly what I wanted. I rang the doorbell, but there was no response. In the hum of the countryside, I couldn't hear if anyone was moving inside, so I rang it again. I made sure it was obvious I was not leaving. After another minute, Mrs. Ash opened the door, her expression as dismissive as ever. "I need to see him." "He isn't home." I looked at her long enough to see her slightly look over her shoulder, a tell that he was in fact there. "I need to see him, please." She still didn't budge. We exchanged a few more words, sharp and tense, before Cameron finally appeared, dressed only in a hoodie, sweatpants, and socks. Ignoring his mom's anger and protests, he shoved a pair of sneakers on his feet, then shut the door behind him. He asked if we could cross the road to my house. I nodded but didn't move from where I stood. He looked at me with confusion before he realized I was waiting for him to lead the way. I could see the tiny bit of hurt in his eyes when he realized I didn't trust him, but understanding washed away his hurt when he considered he couldn't blame me. When we arrived at my house, he hesitated, refusing to go inside. "What do you need? An invitation like some kind of vampire or something?" I quipped, trying to break the tension, but it came out more as a cold insult than a warm joke. He shook his head. "No, nothing like that. I don't want you to be scared. Don't want to put you in a situation where you're uncomfortable." "Too late for that," I laughed. He didn't respond. "Well, you can't sit out here only dressed like that," I replied. "Actually, I can," he smiled, taking a seat on the top step. I joined him on the porch, but kept my distance, the weight of our conversation hanging heavy in the air. I knew what I had to say, but finding the words was another matter entirely. "I know you killed my dad," I said finally. "And that will never be okay. In my world, murder isn't a way of life. But in yours, well, that definition is very different." "It isn't a way of life in my world either." "Yeah, but it's not the same." We sat in silence as a few cars passed by, the night stretching on around us. "Why did you do it?" I asked, breaking the silence. "He was going to kill you and your mom that night," he replied softly. "I couldn't let him." Another silence passed between us, the weight of his words sinking in. "I don't know how to forgive you," I said, finally meeting Cameron's eyes. "But I'll forever be grateful for you." Time seemed to stand still as we sat there, the night moving on around us. Every once in a while, a distant sound would echo from the town or the nearby highway, a reminder of the world beyond our small rural area. I began to shiver slightly, the cold seeping into my bones. He spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd do something like that to him," he said, his words heavy with regret. "I've known your dad, well, known of him my whole life. And I never in a million years would have taken something from you that you cared about, but I always kind of cared about you. Is that why you never talked to me?" I snapped, the bitterness rising in my throat. "Well, you never talked to me either," he replied, his voice tinged with sadness. "And besides, it was probably better for you if I just stayed away." I let out a bitter laugh, the anger boiling inside me. "Don't give me that, stay away from me, I'm a monster stuff you think." "Yes, I do think. After all, I killed your dad." I looked down, "Yeah. Good point." A car passed by, and we didn't say anything for a few more minutes. I looked at the Asha house and imagined how long they've been there. How long did this road belong to their family? To their people or whatever? Since before Elkhorn was a town, the legends of the beast persisted. But I only saw beauty where the past whispered about beasts. Your dad, he isn't the first I protected you from, and he probably won't be the last. I cleared my throat. When did it start? He looked out at the yard deep in thought before shaking his head. I couldn't say exactly. We were very young. He reached down and played with his shoelace for a minute. You know, in my other form, it's not pretty. I sat up. I know. We sat in silence, which was broken by my teeth chattering and the nylon of my coat shaking. Without hesitation, he put his arm around me and pulled me in close. He was surprisingly, but not surprisingly, warm. I knew he would be, but it still shocked me. I'm sorry. Is this okay? He said. Yeah. I didn't know why it was okay. It shouldn't have been okay. He let out a breath of air, and although I wanted it to work, I was still cold. So I broke our first contact and stood to open the door. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. I stood there, unsure of what to do or say. But then slowly I stepped aside, holding the door open. He stood and looked at me with confusion, twinkling his beautiful eyes. Well, come on, I said, my voice softer now. We've got a lot to talk about. Cameron's smile grew, a small glimmer of hope in the darkness. His smile came so quickly, I could hear his lips separate from his teeth. Down, boy, I teased, but there was warmth in my words. I'm not turning my back on you yet. With a nod, he walked past me and into the house. Years of tension fell from my shoulders, the first time I invited a monster into my life.